This is chapter 16. We'll be picking it up in section E, the peak of absolute monarchy, Mazarin and Louis XIV. Louis XIV in France, the king, is the best example of absolute monarchy in European history. In fact, this guy is the longest reigning monarch in European history. And what he did is the most famous and important of any of the people that we're going to look at regarding this theory of government. So this is a good story today. Lots of famous things. The Palace of Versailles is in here. This guy made a huge impact all across Europe, and he's the greatest example of an absolute monarch. Here we go. So he takes over, like most kings, as a little boy, and here's his little boyhood portrait. He looks he looks like a little boy. And the guy that really ran the government for him was Cardinal Mazarin. This is just like the Cardinal Richelieu from Louis XIII. These guys really are the chief ministers of the government. And Cardinal Mazarin continued the work of Richelieu, who came before him, on behalf of Louis XIV. And one of the main things that happens under this guy's substitute rule is this massive civil war called the Fronde in France for about 5 years, and it's a civil war fought primarily between nobles and the forces of the king. The nobles were sick of having their taxes raised by Richelieu, who was trying to centralize authority and create an absolute monarchy. They were sick of being manipulated by Richelieu as well, as he took power away from them time after time. So entire regions of the country stopped paying taxes. And it turned into a 5-year civil war. And basically, what happens is there's a lot of economic disruption in the country. The king realized he had to deal with nobles, or at least find another strategy for subduing them, as opposed to taxing them out of existence. Louis XIV and Mazarin are going to reinvent a way to deal with nobles here in a minute. I'll tell you about that. And really, the impact on absolutism is it made it stronger. In fact, at one point in the Civil War, the enemy forces got to the Paris, and they almost captured little Louis XIV as a little boy, and he was almost these soldiers came in and almost had him at gunpoint, and it really affected him the rest of his life. And so from this point on, he's going to be an even firmer believer in absolute monarchy because he had seen this civil war, and he goes, never again. Okay, so Louis XIV, here he is when he finally inherited the throne in his 20s. The guys love wearing these black curly wigs. That's not natural hair. That's a black wig that they always wear. In fact, these guys were almost bald. They would shave their heads but wear those awesome wigs. The longest monarch of any in European history. He's known as the Sun King. He loved that classical imagery of Apollo, the god of the sun, and he had images of the sun all over his palaces, the sun being the center of the universe, and he loved that feel to it. It's the zenith of absolutism in Europe, Zenith, the peak. In fact, this guy's so important in history that later historians like the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire will come along and call this entire era of European history the age of Louis XIV. So this guy's big stuff, all right? His education, he's not that educated by Renaissance standards, but he did know his history, his geography, spoke a little fluent French, a little Spanish, and a little Italian. But he was more of a hands-on, practical, learned, educated kid, not typical Renaissance stuff. Religious beliefs, strict Catholic, of course. Daily attended Mass daily. Very, very devoted Catholic. As you'll see, he's going to get rid of religious tolerance in France under his rule. His belief in the divine right was strong. He never liked those nobles, distrusted them incredibly because of what they did in the Fronde. He was very cautious as a king, very Machiavellian. A lot of secrecy, a lot of waiting around. When people would ask him a question, will you do this? His favorite answer was something like, je verrai. I'm sure I'm butchering the French, but it just meant, I will see, we shall see. He refused to commit to things and always, was hedged and was kind of neutral. Had a really incredible view of himself, actually, throughout history. He always thought of himself as the center of the nation. He said, I am the state, l'état c'est moi, I am the nation. He saw himself as the embodiment of the whole nation of France. As a physical man, he wasn't very big. He was only 5'5". He was usually overweight most of the time in his life, but he knew how to play the part. He was very aware of the appearance of a king as being so important to the people of the nation and his own personal power. There he is, a little bit older, also carrying that stick, just like the Spanish guys. Look at those red tights. Wow. All right, and then here he is, his most famous portrait of all. He's about 70 years old right here, give or take. White, tight tights, red heels, big robe, big wig, big cane. This is as macho as you can get, actually, believe it or not. For 17th century Europe, this guy's the epitome of masculinity and might and strength. You might not know it, but that's what it was, okay? The Palace of Versailles, this is where it all plays out. He builds this royal palace and moves away from Paris. Here it is. He's got to get away from the fray, away from the people. Moves it out into this. Versailles is a city. It's a suburb of Paris, but he builds this. It was already a little hunting lodge there, hunting palace, and he turned this little country thing into just the biggest royal palace in Europe, really, and the most important ever. And this is where his whole reign plays out. This is like the stage, the theater of politics. Everything is scripted and manipulated and controlled, and this is the home base of it all. It's at Versailles where French culture begins to dominate Europe in every way. Just to kind of go back before you turn the page here, on just in the 1500s, Spain was on top of the world, right? That's the golden age of Spain, the 1500s. In the 1600s, beginning with Louis XIV, France is the most powerful nation in Europe. Just put this in your margins, I think. So the 1600s is really owned by France. In the 1700s and 1800s, England becomes the dominant power in Europe and the world. And then, of course, in the 1900s, it's the United States after World War I and World War II. But this is the peak of French power in the history of France. This is as good as they're going to get, really. They have a little flash with Napoleon a little bit later on, but sustained period of time, this is it. Versailles is the best surviving museum of a vanished society on earth. As we'll get into, the way that the nobles came and lived here, and it preserves this whole form of life that's not there anymore. There really aren't absolute monarchies, and the way this guy controlled everything top down. So this is a monument to that way of life that is no longer there. The palace itself is just incredible. Flip over here to page 6. The art and architecture is just immense. The architect was Le Notre and Laveau. Everything about it is supposed to be big. It's Baroque. Get that? Write that down. It's a Baroque style of architecture, overwhelming. Maybe the most famous room, here's the fountain, gardens, fountains, canals. This is just the backyard. It's an incredible place to see in real life. Huge. There's, again, the classical sculptures all over the place. There's clearly a classical Roman god laid out in front of this pond. Huge, huge place. Okay, the most famous room in it is the Hall of Mirrors, which is like the state room, the reception room, where treaties would be signed or big meetings would be held. You can still go through there. Glass was all imported from other parts of Europe or the world. Gold paint everywhere. It's just the ceremonial big room. Big important treaties are going to be signed here later in history, like World War I is going to be ended right here in this building, in this particular room, actually. So it's a really beautiful place. All right, it's a reflection and a symbol of state power because it's all about wealth and opulence and things done on a huge scale. So it is the symbol, much like the White House is sort of the symbol of our presidency because it's small relatively and sort of humble and not, you can walk through it very quickly. Versailles is the opposite, magnificence in every respect. And it's going to be imitated all over Europe. Every king that ever sees this is going to want his own little mini Versailles. And we'll see that as we move forward. There's going to be lots of little copies of this put all over Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. It's under Louis XIV that the French language gains prominence. It becomes the language of polite society, the language of diplomacy, and it replaces Latin as the international language of Europe. This is the death knell of Latin. Okay, so French culture and language begins to dominate under Louis XIV. Now, how does he deal with these nobles? He's going to make them live at Versailles. This is part of the condition now. of being in the nobility. You're required to live at Versailles. This is their shift. Instead of attacking them, we're going to bring them closer. You keep your friends close and your enemies closer, the old saying goes. So this is his solution. We're going to domesticate them. That word usually applies to animals like dogs and horses. We're going to, housebreak them. We're going to tame them. The nobles of France used to be these warriors that are our enemies, like in the Fronde. And now we're going to make them come and live in our palace and keep our eye on them and transform them from these warriors to these people that are luxury-loving little socialites. And it's an incredible transformation that takes place for the noble class under Louis XIV. Really amazing. He's going to exclude nobles from power by distracting them with fancy living, providing them this incredible existence in the best royal palace in the world at the time. And then they stop, wanting other things like political power. He excludes nobles from his royal council. You don't need that. You don't need to be a part of that. In fact, we're going to put middle class people on that royal council. Remember that? This is all sounding so familiar. And of course, the royal council is really important. That's who makes the decisions. The actual influence in government comes from the royal council. Required participation in a ridiculous number of ceremonies. If you're a nobleman and you live at Versailles, your life is just ceremony to ceremony. There's a dressing ceremony that they all come in and help the king get dressed every morning. There's a good night ceremony where the king officially retires for the evening and everyone's there at his bedside watching him get into bed. I mean, it just never, there's every day, they go on walks, they go on hunting trips. It's all distracting these people from what really matters. So life at Versailles becomes just a party for these rich people. Games, gambling, balls, opera, lots of gossip and intrigue and, infighting and, it's like high school, isn't it? Look at all that. Amazing. People backstabbing each other, but it's all social stuff, okay? So Louis XIV managed to separate power from status for the nobility. They lost power, but they gained status. These nobles become almost like celebrities, and they live this privileged lifestyle, but it's very frivolous. That's the word, frivolous. It's empty, but it works. So this is how he domesticated the nobility. We pampered them, and then they stopped wanting any form of power. All right, moving on here. By 1685, France was the strongest and most highly centralized country in Europe. Here's how he did it. The king was vigilant about details. He personally attended every day the royal council meeting, so he was very active in the affairs of government. No question about it. He used what were the intendants very well. We learned about that the other day. These are the governors. Manipulated and controlled them. Took his new bureaucrats from the middle class because they were easier to control. He never called a meeting of this Estates General, Estates General. That's the Parliament of France. Never called that. And that's where the nobles used to have political power, was in this Estates General. And when you don't call it into session, the nobles can't speak. And they can't complain. And lastly, he used spying and terror, kind of prefacing and like a foreshadowing of powerful totalitarian governments in the future. He was one of the first to use terror and spying. He opened people's mail. All the mail of the nation came through Versailles, basically. And anybody he was worried about, he just had people read the mail and open letters and really spy on people and keep them in fear. All right, let's move on. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the finance minister of France under Louis XIV. And he he didn't invent it, but he perfected the new economic philosophy at the time called mercantilism. And you got to know what mercantilism is. It's a unique economic theory in the history of the world that really has its peak in the age of absolutism. And it's all about making your individual nation the strongest, richest, and most self-sufficient nation ever. And you have to memorize these characteristics, okay? So they heavily regulate the economy. The leaders of the nation, the king and the finance minister, regulate everything by and for the state, okay? It's not about individuals, it's about the nation being strong. Power is based on wealth, particularly the supply of gold. So you want to accumulate as much wealth as possible. To do that, you want a favorable balance of trade. You want to sell as many things as you can that you made, and you want to buy very little from anyone else, other nations. Favorable balance of trade. make money. You want to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is part of mercantilism. Don't want to work with it. You don't really want to equally trade with other nations. You want to sell to them, and they don't, and not have to buy anything from anyone else. You want to subsidize. That means you pay for certain industries that are really in high demand. You want to help the people out, like in the cloth industry or rugs and lace and arms. The government helps control some of these key industries so that they make enough money so that we don't have to import any of this stuff from anywhere else. Okay? So if the industries where they're struggling, the government comes in and helps the people out that are running them, the business class. You inspect and regulate everything. Inspect and regulate all the products so that you have really high quality stuff. You want guilds and you want immigration. You want to have guilds because guilds produce fine products at high prices that you can sell to the world. And then you want lots of immigrants to come in to be workers, to help work in these new industries that are forming. So it's all about you as a nation. You don't want to help anyone else, help yourself only. All right, keep your tariff high. A tariff is a tax on imports. You want high tariffs. Keep out the foreign goods. Keep out the foreign goods. Here's a little graphic that might help you here. Just kind of going over what we've talked about. When you tax, you put a tax on things from other countries so that no one wants to buy it because it's too expensive. You got to have a merchant marine. So you create a fleet of ships to take your goods and take them all over the world and sell them to other places. That's what a merchant marine is, just a fleet of trading ships. And maybe even most importantly, you got to have colonies. Colonies are like your little kid country. You're going to control them, take all the goods from them, and then that's who you sell the finished goods back to. So you see a little graphic on here about that. So the French are going to go out and explore into Canada. They found Canada. This is why Canada has a strong French history. They found Quebec in 1608, and they take 4,000 French peasants from the fields of France, and they ship them over to Quebec to start farming and taking all the produce of their farms and shipping it back to France. So this is serious stuff, top down. Then they founded Louisiana very quickly thereafter that. They're down exploring the mouth of the Mississippi River. This is named after Louis XIV, Louisiana. So it's really, this is happening. And you take the things from the colonies like the raw materials, the gold, the silver, the food product, farm products, raw, and you bring those back to France. You make stuff with it, and then you sell those things back to colonies and anyone else who'll buy it. This is how mercantilism works. Colonies are a huge factor. Okay, and one more graphic here, a little cartoon. Mercantilism always goes with colonies. See this? Gold and silver, food, raw materials are served up to the mother country, and that's how it works. It's not a fair system, but it's how it works. There's great success in France with mercantilism. For the poor, heavy taxes, poor harvests, and population decline. But for the nation itself, it works great. And if you're Louis XIV, money's rolling in from all over the world. In terms of religion, Louis XIV gets rid of tolerance. You can't have that anymore. Okay? He revokes the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Louis XIV gets rid of it. You need one law, one king, and one faith. This is what absolute monarchy is all about. Okay? We've just talked about centralizing the economy. Now you got to centralize religion. So in the margin here, write religion. And we go back, to above here in the section, economics, controlling it. Religion, controlling it. Society, we've already controlled that through the domestication of the nobles. Every area of life comes under some sort of regulation by the absolute monarchs. Okay, very popular decision at the time. People had to go. They had to emigrate. The Huguenots, the Protestants that had been given tolerance, have to leave. A lot of them were hard workers and skilled, and they had to emigrate, and it really hurt the French economy in the areas that those guys used to work. So he reverses the trend of Henry IV. He follows what Louis XIII did, and no more religious freedom in France. That's a state within a state. We got to get rid of it. In the realm of art, here we go. Flip the page. You've got the beginning of state-controlled art. It's called French Classicism. This is the style of Louis XIV's court. It's just like the Renaissance. It's all about discipline, balance, restraint, admiring the classics, Greek and Roman society. No more of this, other stuff. He does use Baroque for his palace, but for painting and music, it's classical. Scenes of Rome, this painting by Poussin, is a scene of life from ancient Rome, this event that took place, and it's honoring the styles of the Romans. There's no individualism in French classicism. Instead, glorification of the state. Lots of rules about every painting had a set of rules. If you're going to paint for the king, you have to follow all these procedures and rules, very regulated. Music was dominated by a composer named Lully. He wrote lots of ballet music for the king. In fact, the king himself danced in several ballets. He put on a ballet outfit and he performed in a little Sun King ballet, and he made people come and watch him dance around at the theater at Versailles. So the king was a big lover of art and culture and dance, to the point that he was even a performer at times. So it's an amazing story. In theater, Molière famously wrote comedies. He wrote satires of the rich and the middle class and the bourgeois, which are the rich people. He mocked them, and people liked that, And so he's a very famous playwright. His plays still are performed today all over in New York and other places. Racine was his themes were the tragedies of life. So very kind of like Shakespeare, comedy, tragedy, just like the Greeks, comedy, tragedy. Racine writes about love and drama and good versus evil, and brings back Roman and Greek legends and puts them on stage at Versailles. But it's all controlled by the king. His wars, he's at war. This is the political impact of Louis XIV. We've got the religion, the art, the politics, now here comes war. He's at war for 33 out of the 54 years that he's king. Okay. However, he invented a pretty modern army. He modernized the French army, created a professional army employed by the state. So he's just like a new monarch. He had personal command of the army. They found new ways to bring in troops and recruit them, like dragooning, which was where you'd go find drunk guys off the street, people that were sleeping one off, and they'd essentially kidnap bums and drunks and put them in uniform and send them to the front. Dragooning, amazing. Think about like 4th Avenue on a Saturday or Sunday morning after all the college students have been watching football and drinking all night, and you go down there and you scoop them up and you take them down to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and put them in the Army. That's what modern dragooning would look like. Improvements, better food. You got to feed these guys better. Oh, you draft them too, by the way. Draft the army. If there's not enough drunks and bums, you just put a draft in and just pull them. Improvements, better food, uniforms and weapons are standardized. You're going to feed the army better. You're going to have better logistics, supply lines. Training and promotion in the army is going to be based on merit. So your worth, how hard you work, as opposed to, who you know. In terms of better food, the guys don't have to steal things from people's farms anymore. The army's going to supply them with food. And maybe most importantly, you take care of your veterans. Look at this. Louis XIV built the first modern VA, a veterans hospital. We call it the VA, the Veterans Administration. Here in America, we've got a VA hospital in Tucson on the south side. It's got a big pink classical dome. In fact, it looks a whole lot like this. But of course, this is the first one. It's called the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, central Paris. This is a veterans hospital for all the guys that get hurt in war. So these wars, and he fought so many of them, didn't actually acquire that much territory. There's a map in your book, map 16.2, will show you the territories that he acquired, which really aren't that much. It's pretty minor. But war is the way that conquerors and strong leaders stay in power. You keep fighting, and it keeps people subdued and distracted. So this is why he fought for so many years. He didn't actually get that much out of it. In fact, it ruins the economy eventually. The resources of the nation are depleted. The currency loses its value. They have to sell more public offices at one point to make money. They had to melt down all the nation's silver at one point as well and turn that into currency. And the tax burden on the peasants have to pay more taxes at one point in Louis XIV's reign. And all of this is leading toward revolution. There's going to be a French Revolution where people get sick of these absolute monarchs in 1789 here, but we're still in basically 1700. And the people are, even though there's this incredible wealth coming in, it's being spent on war so much and to keep up with all the demands of being a monarch of this stature. Let's go into the most famous war of all, the War of Spanish Succession. That starts because of issues in Spain, but it involves France and the rest of Europe eventually. So here we go. We got Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. Remember, the Habsburgs have been running Spain for a long time. And this guy is, well, look at him. He's disabled. He's mentally disabled. He is a result of many centuries of inbreeding among the Habsburgs. He's got the giant chin, the jaw, and he's, among other problems that he sadly inherited, he was unable to have children. He was impotent, and he essentially had sort of a childlike mental condition. Never, he didn't even walk till he was about 6 or 7. So this is terrible. But he's the last king of Spain, and so when he died at about 38 or so years old, in fact, his father, the previous king of Spain, his mother and father, his father was his mother's uncle. Get that. So the father and mother were really uncle and niece. And then this is their son, Charles II. So you can see what's going on here. It's not good. All right, so when he died, in his will, he bequeathed, means he transferred, he said, I give Spain to Philip of Anjou, who's the grandson of Louis XIV. And this guy wasn't, Charles II probably couldn't even read or write, so that most people think that was a fake will that someone else had maybe manipulated him into signing. But either way, this is now legal, that Spain is going to, on paper, is going to become a territory of essentially the King of France and his family. And this is going to make France way too strong to have Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, control the whole thing. So now there's going to be a big war. It's called the War of Spanish Succession. The Dutch said, no way. The English got involved. No way. This is going to disrupt the balance of power in Europe. So a huge alliance forms called the Grand Alliance of England, the Netherlands, Austria, and Prussia. And these guys are going to stop this from happening. They're going to try to stop Spain from being united with France into one super nation run by Louis XIV and his family. So we got to stop French expansion. The two main generals that are playing the game here in the War of Spanish Succession are Eugene of Savoy. He is from the Holy Roman Empire, Central Europe. He actually is for the Austrians. John Churchill of England. Now look at this map if you can see it. This is what Europe looks like at the start of the war, 1700. France is very much one of the most powerful, largest nation states in Europe. Spain is there, all right. England's there. We've got the three main countries from the new monarchies. Central Europe is a complete mess after the 30 Years' War, still run by 300 different princes. And then you've got the Habsburgs still kind of holding on to the eastern part of Europe in yellow. We'll learn more about them in the next chapter. So this is what we got going here. Spain is now, or the Dutch Republic, see that? They're independent now. They won. They beat the Spanish. Spanish still control the Netherlands. Italy's still a mess of city-states. Anyway, we don't want, France acquiring Spain. This is what this war is all about. So they fight. It lasts about a decade. And they win. The Grand Alliance wins. That France is defeated. Spain is defeated. Louis XIV loses. And they are prevented from conquering Spain. Okay? And the war ends with what's known as the Peace of Utrecht. Very famous peace treaty in European history. You got to know a little bit about it. It ends the war. And here's the terms that they agreed to. At the time, they actually said, Philip of Anjou, you can go ahead and become king of Spain. In fact, they gave him a choice. They go, do you want to be the future king of France? Because you're in the line of succession of your grandfather, Louis XIV. Or do you want to be the king of Spain right now? Because, see, the grandfather was still alive. And Philip of Anjou said, I'll take Spain right now. So the Bourbon dynasty, who now ruled Spain, takes over for the Habsburg dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty of France takes over for the Habsburg dynasty of Spain. And now Philip of Anjou became King Philip V. King Philip V changes his name. But here's the terms. The Spanish and French crowns can never be united. They can never join forces. They can never become some super nation. They have to be separate. That's the terms. France also had to surrender all of its overseas territory to England. Okay? This is how they lose Canada. Got it? The French had started to take over parts of Canada, and they have to transfer some of that over to the English because the English beat them in this war. Austria, as a winner, got the Spanish Netherlands. See that on the map here? So that's future Belgium. That had been part of the Dutch in the revolt, but remember they got recaptured by the Spanish. But now that's transferred to Austria, so it becomes known as the Austrian Netherlands. Look at this. There's the map in 1714. I'm going to back it up. 1700. Not much changes. See the colors as they change a little bit? 1700, Spanish Netherlands, Austrian Netherlands. And beyond that, not much, huh? Not a whole lot shifts in terms of territory, all right? So this is the balance of power in operation happening here. Spain is finished as a world power, okay? They're done. They lose this war, they're going to go into extinction, basically. We're going to get to that in the next section. Britain is expanded. Their empire is expanded big time, okay? International cooperation is a theme here. And this ends French expansion. All right, those are the main results. So the Peace of Utrecht. So big treaty. France is now at its, they've been at their peak. They're going to kind of go downhill toward revolution. Spain's going to go downhill into obscurity, and England is going to become, this is one of the big breaks of England's rise to power as they win this war against Spain and France, the two most powerful countries in Europe at the time. All right? So when Louis XIV finally died, people were really happy. Let's go back and look at him here one last time. Wars had brought misery to the country. France was nearly bankrupt. They'd been in just 33 years of war. He's an absolute monarch. He centralized and controlled everything in France. And so when he finally died, there was actually great celebration across the nation. People were relieved. They hoped it would get better with a new king, but sadly it was not. It was going to continue to get worse. They would not modernize. They wouldn't liberalize, and they're going to end up headed toward the French Revolution in another 60 or 70 years. That's it for now.